what are we introducing today? Nikon just released the ZF camera, a highly anticipated model. Many already introduced the ZF, and YouTubers have covered its features. Today, I want to focus on its B&amp W feature, black and white. On the ZF, the B&amp W button is on the dial. With a click, you can take black and white photos. Nikon cameras have always shot in black and white, but before, you had to select it in the menu. Now, the button is up for easier access. Nikon has surprises in black and white. Speaking of black and white cameras, or black and white photography, everyone will definitely think of Leica's MonoChrom. The MonoChrom is a camera that can only shoot in black and white. So this time, I want to try out the black and white mode on the Nikon ZF and see how it holds up. I'll compare it with an M10 MonoChrom to see the difference. So what kind of results will we get from the shots? This time, I'll use a Leica 35-2 f11.879 lens for the comparison. Both cameras are using the same lens model and all the same settings. I'll make sure to set everything exactly the same when taking the photos, so there won't be differences in ISO or shutter speed. So, is there a big difference between photos taken with a Leica MonoChrom and the new ZF's black and white mode? Let's take a look at the photos together now. Let's look at the photo on the left first. This one on the right was taken with a Leica M10. This one was shot with a ZF, converted to black and white mode. You can see the settings, ISO 800. Looking at it, the ZF actually feels pretty good. I like the vibe of the ZF a bit more. Because the contrast is higher, it definitely feels like the ZF has done something extra inside. Like we say in everyday language, it's like adding a bit of MSG. Alright, let's take a closer look at some of the details, one by one. You'll notice that the clothes on the person look more vibrant in the photo taken by the ZF. On the other hand, the photo taken by the Nike M10 looks flat and soft, and it's much closer to what you see in real life. As I mentioned earlier, ZF definitely added some MSG. If you look closely at the details, you'll see that the Nike M10 captures all the fine details of these stairs, while the ZF has already lost them in deep blacks. I feel like the main reason for this is probably the color filter. The ZF is also a color camera, while the MonoChrom is a camera without the three primary colors, so the level of detail in black and white is much higher. But honestly, it all comes down to this: how much do you really need to zoom in? You have to enlarge it by 173% just to see these details. Do you really need that? Let me look at the second photo. On the left, we have a shot from the Leica M10, and on the right, it's from the ZF. It's very obvious that this photo has higher contrast with the ZF. I personally like black and white photos with higher contrast, while the M10 produces a grayer, more true-to-life environment. When you look at it up close, I prefer the black and white feel of the ZF, but in terms of detail, the M10 has a bit more. We need to look at the same subject so we can make a fair comparison. This is a glass reflection, the image reflected by the glass facade. In the Leica M10, you can see all the fine details, the layers, the response, and even the reflections are visible. But with the ZF, the fine text is already lost. You can't see it when you zoom in, and the difference in detail is quite significant. In these elongated areas, you can see the brick pattern here, but on this ZF, you can't see any texture at all. The difference in these fine details is actually pretty big. It's not that the M10M's reputation is undeserved. There's definitely a reason why it has earned its praise. There really are a lot of details here, but overall, the ZF still feels very good. This time, Nikon really put a lot of thought into the black and white aspects. It's not that it didn't do a good job, but because it's not truly a pure black and white camera. Let's look at some other photos and compare them one by one. Look back at this. By the way, let's look back at this photo. These two photos weren't actually taken at the same time, but there was a train just ahead. You'll see the one on the left was taken by ZF, and the one on the right was also taken by Nike. It's obvious that the gray Nike is much richer, while the ZF's has a noticeably higher contrast. Neither one is better, but I personally like high-contrast black and white photos. The details are the same as I mentioned earlier, and it must be the Leica style. There's more layering and information. You can see this air conditioner, and you can also see that feeling. The air conditioner's network is not visible on Bluetooth, but it's very clear on the M10M. The air conditioner's network is visible in grids. Nikon, even the ZF can't see these details, so you can tell them apart by looking at other photos. I shared this photo on Facebook yesterday. This photo actually has a rich image, which explains the black and white images. Because there are light, dark, and transition points, everything you need to see in a black and white image can be seen in this photo. Let's zoom in again. Before zooming in, let me talk about the macro feel. I think it looks better than the ZF because I like the contrast. Maybe I added a little MSG. I like to zoom in a little more to see if the detail is better than the ZF. You can see that the pants of the person walking by are inside the Leica M10M, while the Nikon really does. Some areas are just dead black. If you look closely at these wire fences, like the railings, you can't see each individual piece on the Nikon, but you can see them on the Leica. Looking at the transitions between highlights and shadows, it's very obvious that the grayscale on the Leica M10M is much richer. The Nikon ZF has higher contrast, but the transition from highlights to shadows isn't as smooth. As for the deep shadows, like I mentioned earlier, there are fine details in the dark areas, and you can see a little bit of that on the Nikon. Not everything is lost, but you really have to zoom in and compare frame by frame to see the difference. The highlights, whites, grays, and shadows are layered one after another. The M10M can achieve this, but the ZF's transitions aren't as smooth. Alright, let's compare again. Like I always say with other photos, I'm not biased toward either side when making comparisons. There's no point in favoring one over the other, because the information is very transparent. Even if I don't do it, someone else will, and you'll still see the differences. So I might as well show everyone myself, okay? Alright, if you zoom in on this photo and look at it like this, honestly, the difference isn't that big. Looking at the way the ZF captures the light, I actually think it's better than the Leica M10M. If we're talking about the details, I believe it's about the same as the other photos from before. Let's take another look here. Let's check out the glass area. This glass area in the ZF. There are actually fewer details in the Leica, while the ZF seems to have some settings applied. It probably lowered the highlights and increased the contrast. To look at these details, if you shoot RAW with the M10M, you'll get a lot more information for post-processing. But if you're only shooting JPEG with the ZF, that's really not fair. I actually think the ZF wins here. The details in these glass areas seem even better than the M10M. Even finer. Looking more closely at other areas, the ZF's level of detail actually seems higher than the M10M, gradually shifting. In other areas, like the elongated parts, the ZF is clearly very smooth and flat. And with the Leica M10M, you can also see the detail in the elongated areas. These parts are where the M10M stands out. You can see that this kind of detail and layering actually wins back over the ZF, so it's not one-sided. Sometimes I think it's really good. Alright, let's head to LV. Okay, back to LV. This LV photo was actually a bit tricky to take. Because the exterior wall of LV has a lot of fine details. You can see, looking at this. Looking back at the overall photo, I still prefer the ZF a bit more because it always has higher contrast. The difference between the blacks and whites is a bit more pronounced, and I personally like that a bit more. This is really subjective though. It depends on each person, and not everyone will see it the same way. On the other hand, I feel like the photos taken with the M10M tend to look kind of gray. But when you zoom in to look at the details, it's really obvious. When you zoom in on the Leica M10M and look at Tiffany's logo, it feels really nice. Let's slowly scroll down and take a look. Looking at the shadows and the full body, ZF. It really can't capture that kind of texture. Leica really brings out each detail, one by one. If you keep looking at the details, it's really obvious. The manhole cover, Leica really makes it pop out, but the ZF just can't get it right. It really can't capture it. But I do like this sign on Devoe Road Central. With a bit higher contrast and a bit more clarity, wow, looking at the full body shot of LV, it's really hard to capture its texture. ZF does a really good job with each and every detail too. You can see the sense of depth is pretty good too, even though it feels quite flat. But every single detail is right here. Let's go through it frame by frame and take a look. The LV lettering really stands out on the ZF, while it's a bit better on the Leica. But I like that high contrast look. Everyone has their own preference. If we're talking about detail, the M10M definitely has much higher detail resolution. But when it comes to black and white photos, Nikon does a pretty good job too. Now let's look at the highest ISO. What's the ISO for this shot? The Leica is at 50,000 ISO, and the ZF is at 51,200 ISO, so they're pretty much the same. You can see that the M10M really looks a bit grayer, and the Nikon ZF has noticeably higher contrast. It's definitely more eye-catching. Don't focus too much on whether it's in focus or not. The focus point might be a bit different for each shot. When you listen to the sound, the difference is actually really obvious. The M10M sound isn't as pronounced and has some subtle details, while the Nikon ZF sound is also quite impressive. But then again, at ISO 51200, you can still hear the sound and see the details of the camera. I think technology is advancing so fast now. What did ISO 50,000 even mean in the past? Back then, I don't think you could see anything at all, but now it's clearly visible. If you run it through AI denoise, I think it can already look really good. But with a mono M10M, its main selling point is that the high ISO noise is very smooth. This actually all comes down to the issue of the RGB filter. Because there's no color noise in the M10M. So you'll notice that it's a bit smoother, but even the ZF at ISO 51200 can achieve this kind of result with its noise. Honestly, it's really acceptable. Technology these days is just so advanced, so beautiful. That's all for the photos I'm sharing here. You can see some comparisons, but let's not say which one is better or worse. How a photo looks is always a very subjective feeling. Of course, if we're talking about details, Leica is definitely higher than the ZF. Overall, the ZF's black and white photos are done really beautifully. After looking at those photos, we really realized that this black and white mode is truly impressive. This time, I think Nikon put a lot of thought into the black and white aspect. It makes a black and white photo present itself with a really beautiful performance. This comparison this time is really just for fun, just to see how they stack up against each other. What will the results be like? You really don't need to look at the data too seriously for this. If you can get the ZF for just over $10,000, shoot both color and black and white, and it looks great on the outside, plus, the whole thing feels like an FM2 or even an F3. For us Nikon fans, it's something we're really looking forward to. And honestly, I'm so happy to have it back in my hands. All those feelings come rushing back. In a couple of days, I'll be using the Nikon to shoot portraits, so I'm curious to see how it performs with manual lenses. In the next video, I'll go take photos with my wife, try out manual lenses, Nikon lenses, and Leica lenses on the ZF. That's it for today's sharing. Thanks everyone for watching. Bye.